Syria is the most dangerous assignment CBS News correspondent Clarissa Ward has ever done. Relying on rebels and militants to protect her and give her safe passage, Ward crossed into the Islamic State battleground 11 times. In a 2015 interview with the New York Times, Ward said, "You don't have access to proper medical facilities if you were to be injured, and you can't plan things in Syria and have a very organized, systematic mindset. You just have to accept that that's not the way Syria works." Ward is not alone in her dangerous endeavor as a female correspondent. Through my research, I have discovered that female correspondents aren't that rare in a day and age where women are increasingly on the front lines. As media consumers, we need to understand and recognize the courage behind the work of journalists and the sacrifices they make for justice. Today, I'm going to show you how women correspondents are watchdogs who can better fight for the political and social equality of other women. I'm going to first talk about the women on the front lines in zones of conflict, how female correspondents can help these women be recognized as legitimate and vital sources of information, and finally, the courage it takes correspondents to work in violent zones of conflict. First, let's take a look at the difference it makes to have women journalists in zones of conflict. In areas of the world where women are oppressed by their cultures, women journalists can better understand how political and military developments affect the lives of individuals, particularly that of other women, according to a 2014 CNN article titled "Why We Need More Women Journalists on the Front Lines." That being said, only 1/3 of news stories are told by women, and in a study done by the Women's Media Center, they found that in the New York Times, men were quoted 3.4 times more often than women. However, this number decreased as women were the ones telling the stories. One of these women is 2008 recipient of the Courage of Journalism Award, Frida Nezhad. Nezhad works for women and with women to help them find a voice. In a 2009 article in Mosaic titled "Afghan Journalist Awarded for Her Bravery in the Face of Madness," Nezhad said, "I am driven by being a role model for women so that they can be encouraged and not be silenced, which is not an easy task." Nezhad's work in Afghanistan is particularly important. Before 9/11, a Center for Disease Control study found that Afghan women had the highest rates of depression of anywhere else in the world. This depression was higher than that of Afghan men. Women were living voiceless under Taliban rule, where even the sound of women's laughter was considered a crime, according to the previously cited CNN article. This depression is being lifted somewhat, however, with women journalists coming in and telling the stories, from advocating to the education of young girls to showcasing the talented women in parliament who have made a difference in a male-dominated society. So now that you can see how it makes a difference to have women journalists telling the stories of other women, I'm going to talk about how these journalists can also help women be seen as important sources of information, because women do need to be seen as legitimate and vital sources of information. When a journalist tells a story of a nation of war solely from a man's perspective, they are telling a story of a nation of half its citizens, according to a 2001 article in Nieman Reports titled "Reporting on War and Listening to Women." When women are used as sources, they are more often than not quoted as private individuals rather than citizens with a sense of authority, according to a 2011 article in the Journal of Women's Studies and Communication. More so, the gender coverage of war cannot be exclusively about sexual exploitation. Indian journalist Amu Joseph said that if women hold up half the sky during times of peace, they certainly hold up even more of it during wartime. The media has a responsibility to recognize and report. Another one of these female journalists reporting is Indonesian war journalist Ratu Hardono. Hardono, while covering the war in Indonesia, was approached by a woman whose husband was being buried that day. The woman pointed to Hardono's camera and sat down next to her husband's coffin, while Hardono took pictures of her. Afterwards, the woman wrote her address on a piece of paper and gave it to Hardono so that she could track her down later with a translator and hear her story. When Hardono returned, she listened to this woman tell her story about how, now that her husband was dead, her children would no longer be able to attend school, and they would continue living in the cycle of poverty their mother was living in. Stories like this, that are told from a woman's perspective, that are so different from a man's stories, are important to understanding the consequences of war, Hardono said in her 2003 article in Nieman Reports. However, there tends to be a pattern of gender logic in the way these stories are told, a pattern of men telling the public stories of business, power, and politics, while women tell the private stories of family, health, and fashion, according to a 2008 article in the Columbia Journalism Review. Is there a problem to gender logic, however? In my opinion, Some stories can only be told to women by women. An example of this is Andrea Bruce's work in Iraq. As a freelance photographer, Andrea Bruce befriended an Iraqi prostitute. She was allowed to photograph her while she was working. The story of the Iraqi prostitute was able to show the harmful effects prostitution has in Iraq, and it wouldn't have been able to be told in this way by a male journalist. So although this doesn't defend the idea of gender logic, it does reinforce the idea that women are needed to tell the story, especially in areas of the world where male guardianship prohibits women from freely talking to men. So now that you can see why it's important for women journalists to tell the stories of women and how they can also help them be seen as important sources of information, I'm going to talk about the courage it takes for these correspondents to work in violent zones of conflict. As a profession, journalism is becoming increasingly dangerous, as reporters are no longer seen as unbiased observers. Since 1992, 1,212 journalists have been killed on the job. For women journalists, this isn't the greatest fear they have to face. Many are targeted victims of sexual assault for their work. While covering Arab Spring in 2011, 60 Minutes correspondent Laura Logan endured a brutal sexual assault when she was separated from her crew in a mob. In an interview after the attack, Logan said, "It's difficult for me to be away from this story. I feel like I have failed because I did not deliver," she said in a 2011 article in the New York Daily News. This is the reason many female journalists don't report their assaults. They don't want to lose their assignment. However, a survey done in 2005 by the International Media Safety Institute sent to 150 female foreign correspondents, of whom only 29 responded, found that half of those 29 had been sexually harassed and 2 had been sexually assaulted while working. Correspondents also face an increased risk for PTSD, substance abuse, and depression. A study done of 218 frontline journalists found the rates of PTSD in those journalists 5 times higher than in the general population. For both male and female correspondents, the work of journalism in zones of conflict is extremely stressful. I began my story by talking about CBS News correspondent Clarissa Ward and her work in Syria. Ward goes on to say that working in areas of the world where there's constant sniper rifle fire and barrel bombs dropping, that it just takes a toll psychologically. You can never relax, you can never decompress. There's a constant sense of fear and stress. I hope you can always remember why we need female journalists telling the stories of other women, how these journalists can help other women's voices be heard, and the courage it takes for these journalists to work in violent zones of conflict. Because it takes courage to be a voice for the voiceless, and it takes courage to work in a field that remains firmly dominated by men. However, as you can see here, it makes a difference to have women on the front lines of journalism.